read verses 3 and 4. John chapter 9, verse 3 and 4. Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I'm in the world, I am the light of the world." Last 2 weeks we've been in John chapter 9, and we saw from John chapter 8 that Jesus has been attacked by this group of Jews in the temple who didn't like what he had to say about their sin, didn't like what he had to say, or what he had to say about who he was, that he was equal with God, that he was sent from God. They didn't like what Jesus proclaimed about himself, and they take violence and vengeance into their own hands at the end of chapter 8, and they try to stone Jesus with stones. The scene then shifts in chapter 9 to what happens outside of the temple when Jesus passes by a man who was born blind. Now, obviously, this man has suffered greatly when it comes to his life. All right, he has never seen the world that he lives in. He has never seen what he looks like. He's never seen what his parents looks like, what anybody looks like. Was probably as close to a leper as you could probably come to within Jewish society. The insults that he would have heard over his lifetime would have been devastating. He has had nothing to compare any image to because there's been no image across his eyes. He was born blind. He lived in a world that was only made up of sound, smell, touch, and taste, no sight. And we talked at length about the mindset of the Jews and even the disciples when it came to looking at birth defects like this, suffering like this. And the first question that they asked reveals what their thought process was, and that was what? Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind like that? Okay, so that reveals what they were thinking. So there was some type of suffering that was happening, and they were wanting to try to figure out why. And there was something that was happening to this man as a baby, as a child, as a young teenager, as a man. He was born blind, okay? We don't know how old he was when he met Jesus. Jesus met him. But this man suffered a great deal and grew up in an economy of suffering. And I want you to remember that phrase because it's going to come into play later. He grew up in an economy of suffering, all right? His parents had experienced this economy of suffering because his parents would have been seen as outcasts amongst the Jewish world because the Jews presumed very wrongly, just like the disciples did, that they did something to anger God. They committed some sin, and the blindness of their son was the result of God punishing them. That was the way the Jews looked at them, and they would be seen as someone you did not want to talk to, you didn't want to be around, who was suffering the consequences of their wrongdoing. And the answer of Jesus really got me struggling, and that was the reason why we only got through 2 verses tonight. It was kind of a deep dive into a lot of things that I've struggled with. This is Jesus kind of answering a question or correcting a thought process in chapter 9 and verse 3 when he said, "It is not that this man sinned or his parents." And I got that part. That part's the easy part, right? When Jesus says it's not that this man sinned, it's not that his parents sinned, this is not because of sin, all right? Then there was the part that I had to try to get my head around. And that's the explanation that Jesus speaks in the last part of verse 3 and in verse 4. And he says this, "But that the works of God might be displayed in him." And that really was, I didn't know how to explain that. So I wanted to go back and define all of these things and see the words that Jesus used. So just as a side note, I guess you would say, as a kind of a preface to this, everyone in here has suffered in different ways, all right? You don't know the ways I've suffered in my life, and I've experienced suffering, and I don't know the ways that you've experienced suffering. Everyone here has suffered. But we have all experienced in some way, and if we have not, just wait a few years, all right? Jesus says, in this world, you're going to have trouble. John chapter 16, verse 33. This is not heaven, and we are not meant to see this life as our end destination. The pain reminds us of that. Loss reminds us of that. And even suffering reminds us that this world's not our home. There is something greater and better that is waiting for us on the other side of death and away from this world. I do not want you to think that I know all the answers to this, and I don't want you to think that I'm dismissing or trying to explain away what anyone has gone through or that I know what you're experiencing, because our experiences are very different when it comes to suffering. I was born with birth defects, like we went over last week, but they were not as intense as like Casey's aunt being born with spina bifida and never being able to walk, or Jace being born with a heart defect, or this man in John chapter 9, his suffering experience of a defect is very different than mine, all right? This is Jesus explaining what he sees as the great I am, as God in the flesh, when he sees this man who was born blind from birth. And when Jesus sees this man suffering, Jesus sees something very different than his disciples. He sees something very different than the culture of the Jews that were around them. He sees something very different than oftentimes we see when it comes to suffering. Like we talked about last time, we see suffering a lot of times in the present tense. What our eyes presently see, what we are going through in present experiences, but God sees it differently. God sees what we go through in every tense, in every lens, past, present, and what that will produce in the future, all at one time. When we're going through suffering, we only see what's right in front of us. We don't see how this could be something that was turned into good. That's where faith comes in. We'll talk about that in a minute. But at the same time, we only see what we're going through right now. God sees every sparrow fall, and he sees where it falls. He sees every hair on our head that we lose, where I lost it, the stories behind every hair that was released from my head when it came to stress, where that stress came from, and all the stories of my life that I've lived and the stories of my life that I haven't lived yet, all right? God can see what I cannot see. When we are suffering, Jesus sees something that is totally different. And in a rather transformative way, and in a rather transformative viewpoint, Jesus looks at the blind man and he sees a totally different thing than what the disciples do. He sees the viewpoint of God. So there's just a couple of things that I want you to keep in mind as we go through this discussion, these guardrails that kind of keep us on track. So by no means is this going to be an exhaustive lesson or explanation of every detail of suffering and why everything's happening when it comes to you or when it comes to everybody else. But this is an explanation that Jesus teaches his disciples as their rabbi and as their teacher when they ask the question and they conclude something that's very wrong in the question that they ask, that this man sinned or his parents sinned, and that's the reason why he was born this way. So I wanted to find the terms that Jesus uses, and this really challenged me to think and rethink and take a look at a lot of things in my mind, which is what the Word of God is meant to do. Whenever you study and you read the Word of God, it is meant to change your viewpoint and perspective about everything in your life towards the perspective of God. Jesus says that this blind man's the birth that this man had of being blind had nothing to do with his parents, but he says it was that the works of God might be displayed. And that word work is where this all started. And it floored me whenever I was reading about this. Just this one word changed everything that I looked at. It's the Greek verb ergo, E-R-G-O. And it's unlike our English word when it comes to work. Now, our English word is very vague. It's very general. You know, I'm going to work, work at this, work at that, When we see this word in the Greek language, it's very specific, and it's very particular, describing a process or a performance or a work that comes out of something else. A process that arises, this is where we're coming to the economy part, a process that arises from an already established economy. Now, we just have the word work in our English language, but ergo is talking about a work that is performed in an already cultivated landscape. God is performing a work in an already cultivated landscape. And what do you think about it like this? Let's say you own 15 acres of land, all right, and you want to work that land, you want to farm that land, you want to raise cattle on that land, whatever. There's a huge difference between buying 15 acres of land that is already cultivated land and 15 acres of uncultivated woods that you have to clear cut those and level out and start from scratch. Starting the cultivation process from scratch is different than using something that you already have. In this word, we see that God is using something that is already in the world to display his works. This word for work that Jesus uses is describing that God is working through something that is already in the world. That God is working in the world and cultivating in the world and using a part of the world, not removing that part of the world, but using that part of the world to do his work, to display his work. So Jesus explains very matter-of-factly in his response to the disciples that there is suffering in this world. There is going to be suffering in this world. That suffering already exists in this world and will always exist in this world. And we can argue over where it comes from. That's not what Jesus argues when it comes to this text. That's what the disciples did. That's not what Jesus is pointing out. Suffering is in the landscape of this world. It is a constant cultivation that none of us are ever going to escape this side of heaven. Some of us know this more than others because as you get older, pains of your body constantly remind you that you are not as young as you used to be. How many of you are feeling that? That your body tells you you're not as young as you used to be. Some of you can easily see that you are closer to death than you are to birth. that your body is breaking down and your friend list on the other side of the grave far exceeds the one that is on this side of the dirt. Suffering and pain and loss is a constant in this world. It is present year after year after year. It has been that way since Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, and this world has not changed. This world is not going to be free of suffering until Jesus comes back and we're forever with the Lord. Yet, Jesus explains, God is at work, E-R-G-O, through something that is already here. That God is at work and cultivating his work through something that's already here and through something that will always be here and something that will not go away in this world. That God is working with what is already in the world, and he cultivates and displays his work through suffering. God is at work everywhere. Now, I want this to be the platform of this next point. God is at work everywhere. Now, do you believe that? That God is at work everywhere, and there is not a time and there's not a place that God does not work or have his hand at some point in time. We believe that when it comes to creation. You can see God is at work everywhere. You can see it in the supermoon last night, the full moon tonight. You can see it in the sunrise in the morning. You can see the change of the seasons, the leaves falling everywhere. We believe and we know that God is already at work here. And God, in the same way, is also working through suffering that is already here. Suffering that each of us have experienced on some level. If you can see God in the changing landscapes and the seasons, you can see God in the changes that suffering brings to your life. Let me say that again. If you can see God in the changing landscapes and the seasons, you can see God in the changes the landscape of suffering has made in your life. We usually see those lessons later on in life, not when we're actually going through them. We look back and we see God was there the entire time. So do I believe that God can display his glorious works through the economy of suffering that is already in this world? Do I believe that God can take the struggle-filled life of this blind man and use that to display and produce something that is good? We have to believe that because we believe that about Jesus. This world was lost in sin and despair and without hope. That was the economy of the world. It is the economy of the world without Jesus. That was the landscape that Jesus came into. He came from heaven to earth. He came from perfection to the greatest of imperfection. He came from glory to be rejected by those he came to save. When Jesus came to the world, sin did not disappear. When Jesus came into the world, there was already an economy of sin that was here. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem, sin didn't cease to be. When he was crucified on the cross, the world wasn't wiped clean from every sin, but God continued to work within a world that was cultivated in sin. And from the worst of all murders in the entire world came the greatest of salvation. And from the worst of all suffering in Jesus on the cross, God worked the greatest gift. You believe that whether you know it or not. You believe that God can take the greatest of suffering on the cross and bring about the greatest of gifts. Now, what we don't like to hear when it comes to, passages like this is that this does not explain suffering. Jesus does not explain suffering when it comes to this message. Jesus corrects a wrong conclusion that people like the disciples have come to about suffering. But Jesus doesn't explain suffering. He explains what God does with it and how God can and does use it. The definition of work, ergo, the process that arises from an already established economy, God is using what is already here. It's a crude illustration, but let's say that you were given $100,000 in $100 bills, okay? It was just given to you. You can use that money however you want to. Now, you use it in the already established economy of the world. You can spend it however you want. You can spend it on your family, on a vacation. You can spend it on hunting gear and guns. You can spend it on a new vehicle, down payment on a house. You can use it in 100 different ways. There is a number of ways to use that in this already established economy. But there are also ways you can use that money that is given to you to display the works of God. You can give it away. You can sponsor a kid going to Titus. You can give it to the church. You can give it to a soup kitchen. You can find someone who is in need. You can help them. You can find 1,000 people who are in need. You can help them. Because ask yourself the question, if God was given $10,000 in this economy, not that he cares about money or needs money, how would he use that money? In the economy that he would be in, how would he use that money? To show and display his works. Is the economy of the world perfect? Absolutely not. Far from it. But God uses what is already established in the economy to manifest His work. God uses the suffering in this world that is always going to be to manifest and display His work. What Jesus explains is what God does. That God works through the already established economy of suffering in this world. Jesus is not explaining away suffering. And to be honest, Jesus is not even in this passage explaining suffering at all. He is simply correcting a wrong view the disciples had about it. And I'm not trying to explain suffering when it comes to every explanation of the suffering you have gone through, because we're just looking at this through the eyes of Jesus and the words of Jesus. Jesus is explaining how God works through this world's already established economy of suffering and how God's works are displayed within it. Brings us to the second word, that the works of God might be displayed. There is the economy of suffering in this world, and then there is the light that God brings through it. That's what this word means, to be on display, something that is emitted with light, something that is displayed because light is shining upon it. Once again, the more that I studied about this, the more it opened my eyes. The Greek word is pheno, and once again, very particular. The light is not what is being described when this word is used. It is the comprehension of what is now seen or exposed. That just kind of shook my world. When suffering happens in the economy of this world, the works of God are on display. It's not the light that we are focused on when it comes to this. It is what the light is pointing towards. Just like when it came to the disciples. They were so focused on the blind man that they didn't see the explanation of Jesus that was right in front of them. That this man could show or display the works of God. In suffering, there is always going to be light, but a recognition has to take place. There was a recognition that there was a blind man that was born from birth, but that recognition led to two different places. When Jesus saw that and recognized that, he saw something totally different than the apostles or than the disciples did. All the disciples saw was this man was born blind. Who sinned? They were looking at one very closed-minded view of a blind man's situation in life. Jesus, on the other hand, doesn't shine the light on the blind man and leave it there, because it's not just about the suffering of the blind man. Because like we said before, suffering is in the economy of the world, and that's what God is going to use. The focus of Jesus is on the comprehending of what God could do with this man, what God could do with the situation, what God could do when it came to the suffering. There is a big difference, and I really want you to key on this. There is a big difference between seeing suffering, which everyone can see. Seeing suffering, you can see that every day if you want to read about it, and you can read about it as long as you want on any news outlet. There is a big difference between seeing suffering and having faith in a God who can display himself through it. Everyone can see suffering. Not everyone has the faith to know that God is able to display himself through it. I don't want to go too deep, but I was reading a study on this word, pheno. I'm not a scientist by any stretch, but it was amazing. He explained this by using the illustration of wavelengths of light. I have no idea about wavelengths of light. It was just it was something that clicked in my brain for some reason. The light that comes from our sun, we see in one color. I would not recommend that you look at the sun, but usually the light that comes from the sun, we interpret that with our eyeballs as white. The color that comes from the sun is actually all the colors of the rainbow. We can't see that. We can only see certain colors of light when it passes through something that shows us all the different wavelengths, like a prism. Our eyes don't see all the wavelengths. They need help to see all the wavelengths. And when an object is put into the spectrum of all of that light that is coming from the sun, the wavelength, this is where it gets scientific, I know, the wavelength that it rejects becomes its color. You put a ruby up to the sun, what color is it? What color is a ruby? Red. It rejects and absorbs all other wavelengths of light except for red. You don't see blue when you look through a ruby. You don't see green when you look through a ruby. All you see is red. You put up a ruby, and the sun shines through that ruby, and you have a whiteboard behind it, all you see is what? Red. That's the only wavelength you see. You know this because you have, or we have in our English vernacular, if someone sees something in one way, they're wearing what type of glasses? Rose-colored glasses. So everything that is seen through those glasses has a particular tint. Only one wavelength, right? But there are so many other wavelengths when it comes to the light, and so many times we see suffering in one wavelength. We try our best to see and understand with our human mind and our finite details, yet the same suffering that is seen by God, that was seen by the disciples, was totally different in how they saw it and how they explained it. God sees every wavelength of suffering and how his works and it can be and are on display. Jesus doesn't just see a blind man that was born unable to see. Jesus sees the wavelengths that God can use to bring about and display his glory through the suffering that they see. It is very easy to look at suffering in a single wavelength, not knowing all of the wavelengths that are behind it and around it that God sees that we don't. So, do we believe that God can display his works through suffering, through any suffering, through all suffering? And then it comes back to us. Do I believe that God can be displayed through my suffering, through my loss, through my pain? Can God be on display through that? Do I believe that God sees more and knows more and has the power to do more than I do? That God doesn't just see suffering, but he can be on display through it. Now, I know there was a lot to take in, and that was all I wanted to write because I was like, this is pretty deep stuff, all right? And I had a lot to digest when it came to this, so that's all I wrote. I mean, it's only 7:30, so I got a lot to talk about. So I know how this hit me when it came to how Jesus explained when he looked at the blind man. How did it hit you?
Well, he takes and uses and makes good stuff happen when bad stuff isn't even there. You know, there's good things happen to us that, how come that happened? You know, that was God, you know, doing it. He's not only curing somebody that's got a pain, but he also gives us good things happening, you know, by every day going through life.
That's true.
This reminds me of something similar that you've been talking about with Lazarus. Mary, they sent word to Jesus, and he's only 2 miles away. He stayed 2 days. And the reason he stayed 2 days was, he could give God similar to what we're seeing here, the works that him raising Lazarus. In my mind, it seems real similar situation as far as the works that he was, from the suffering that they went through because of the loss. He's going to manifest God.
That's a really good illustration because I would say that we would have empathy with Mary and Martha, knowing that their brother was dying and that Jesus was so close, and saying, "Why did you not come?" Now, unwrap that for me. Why is that something that you can empathize with? You have a sibling who is dying. Jesus is 2 miles away, and you are suffering immensely. What is the present tense that you're living for those 2 days? What is all that you're seeing? All that you're seeing is Lazarus die. Why is God not here? Why is Jesus not here?
That's what they told him as soon as they saw him. If you had been here, he wouldn't have died.
Yeah. So you can understand as well as I can the mindset of those sisters when it comes to the suffering that they went through for those days that they sent word to Jesus. He didn't show up. Because I don't know if you've been that way or not when it comes to certain prayers you've prayed, things that you've asked God to do, people that you've prayed for, and things didn't go the way that you asked him to. And usually when things don't go the way you ask him to, how's the response when it comes to us? We get upset. Because that's all we see. We don't look back. 20 years in the future, with 2020 vision going, you know, I learned a lot from that. My faith grew a lot in that. I understand a lot more when it comes to looking back than I do when I was going through. One of the things I was explaining not too long ago. There were times that scripture would be quoted to me when my sister was dying. That was the worst feeling. Because all I could see was what was happening. Now you might think, well, that doesn't seem very good. Mary was the same way, Martha was the same way. We don't have the sight to see how God is working through all the things that we are suffering through. We don't have that sight. We have the promise. But that promise, every promise that God gives you requires what? It hasn't been fulfilled yet, so you're looking at things that are unseen. We've talked about this on Sundays. It requires you to have faith. Every promise that God gives you requires you to have faith. It is very hard to look at what is right in front of you when you're suffering through it and have faith that on the other side of it is something that is good.
There's a movie that reminds me of that too. I can't think of the name of it right now, but the person that gets killed in a car wreck, and I think Will Smith's in it. Yeah, 9 lives. It shows the nine different people that he donated things
It's
to.
something
how
pounds.
it saved their lives.
9 pounds,
Yeah,
7
there you go.
pounds, something like that.
Yeah, and that kind of makes you think of that too, because God, like my favorite verse, Romans 8:28, everything works together. We don't see the, and I've had some, I think that's why wisdom comes with age, because you don't see it till you get older. You know, you're young, you don't understand it, but like I do, even when I lost my brother, my dad started going to church, and he had prayed and prayed and prayed, and that's the one thing it took to get his heart.
And that, I wanted to put this illustration down, but the most, I guess you could say, reaction to the gospel that I have seen in my entire life is at funerals. I'm not saying the gospel doesn't work everywhere. I'm just saying that when you are preaching at a funeral, there are people who are thinking about more things at that point than they've ever thought about in their entire life. That they would not be thinking about unless they were going through that loss or suffering. And being reminded of that. That their life is but a vapor. Okay? Now you take away that loss and you take away that suffering. You take away the element of driving them towards something that is outside of this world. I'm not saying that I want anybody to lose anyone or I want to go through loss. But I am saying that you can easily see, from my perspective anyway, where everything changes because they're going through that loss or because they're going through that particular scenario of suffering. I don't want people to suffer, but there is a reason sometimes behind that, and that is to drive them towards God. I'm waiting, Carmen. Just tell me. Don's sitting too close. Huh?
That same situation with Mary and Martha and Lazarus also shows us something else. At 11:35, Jesus wept. Now, why did he cry? Well, we know because it was
Well, let me ask you a question. And if you want to put yourself into this category, you can. But for those of you who have way more people on the other side of death than you have on this side, how has that changed your perspective on life? That you've gone to the funerals of people that you've grown up with, the people that were in your family that your age, your cousins, and how has that changed the way you look at life now? Or has it? Nobody wants to put themselves in that category.
It's changed my prayers, I'll say that. I used to have long prayers, and now it's more like, thy will be done. I mean, I just, God, you do it, because I'll mess it up, you know.
That's where I've changed, like my prayers, like still asking for somebody, I don't know, like they've got stage 4 cancer, like I've never seen anybody have like stage 4 cancer and then they're just miraculously healed by prayer. I mean, it's kind of like God has chosen this to happen, you know, it's His will, and you just pray, you know, that something good would come of it, because I don't feel like praying for healing, I don't know, it's kind of a gray area for me. I believe in prayer, but do I really think someone that has a terminal illness, they always die, from what I've seen. I've never seen like a miracle healing. But it's like God's meant for this to happen. Hopefully I can understand why it's happening.
James chapter 5 addresses that real directly. Very directly. And it should, as you pointed out, it should change the way we pray. Because God knows what's happening. And for us to, we fall, and I mentioned this to the kids Sunday, we fall into that category where our prayers start out and we get into this habit of help me, help me, help me, help me, help me, help me, help me. Well, you're telling God something that He already knows. He already knows what we need. And He already knows what healing would be. Now, one of the places where we fail with God's instructions is, how many times do we go see the elders to get them to for healing? Well, what are they praying for? They may be praying for healing, but the healing that takes place is the forgiveness of their sin.
I'm bringing the oil.
Pardon?
I said, I'll bring the oil. You bring the elders. Sorry, that was a joke in the context of James 5. If you it says that, you know, you're to bring it before the elders, they'll anoint your head with oil. Sorry. But yes, I understand. It's
And it should change the way that we pray and the way that we think when we're talking to God. It really should change the way that we talk to Him and communicate with Him. Because instead of me being so selfish and asking for, you know, when I'm in a crisis, asking Him to help me, get me, you know, tomorrow is going to be awful for, you know, whatever crisis you're dealing with, to the point where my faith in what God knows and what He can do should be able to carry me through and to get me through to ask Him what I need to ask Him, instead of just saying, please help me. Because He already knows what we need.
what?
Well, I don't want to sound like I disagree, but something did happen to me.
Yeah.
And I did say, God, help me, God, help me. That's the only 3 words I could say. God, help me, God, help me. And I thought, am I selfish? No. God, help me, God, help me. Because He said you had not.
Because yes.
Because you didn't ask for it. So I believe God is a father. We're little children down here. And I'm going to ask my Father for anything that I
kind of like the devotional song. I don't know if we've sung it here, but Lord, my desire is to be like you. Say the things you say and do the things you do. And it's the same thing. But just to get back to James 5 that you brought up. In James 5 and verse 17, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. And he prayed fervently that it might not rain for 3 years and 6 months, and it did not rain upon the earth.
So go back to First Kings where that came from
Yeah.
and figure out that God told him what to do.
Yes.
God gave him the direction. This is what you pray for.
Yeah.
And you pray for no rain for 3 years and it's not going to rain.
And that's where I was going. Back in verse 16, it says, the prayer of a righteous person, like Elijah was, avails much. Because that righteousness was lined up with God's righteousness. So, I see where you're coming from. I see where you're coming from. Yeah.
God knows our heart, whether we pray it or not. If we're thinking it, He knows it, so I don't think that.
Oh, yeah.
But I know with me, I used to get the God winks when my kids were teenagers or whatever. Just like with Christmas lists, when the little kids will ask for everything, they know they just ask for everything. Then, when they get older, they start being more mature and asking for what they really need or really want. And I think sometimes we're guilty of that. When we're young Christians, we ask for everything. And I think as we get older, we get asking for health is great, but like when we're younger, we may ask for things that don't even mean anything in our Christian life. I don't know. I think we can be childlike as Christians and we grow. Just like we think our kids are immature, we're immature and we're asking for selfish things when we're younger, but when we get older, we know what's important in life.
And I guess we'll close with this. If you are given a promise and you have total faith in that promise, would you keep asking for the promise, or would you ask for, or would you speak thanksgiving? I guess that's a big thing. If I know God's promises, I'm going to thank Him for them if all of my faith is in Him. And that's going to be the first thing that I speak to God is thanksgiving. I'm not saying that you don't tell Him, like Elijah, please don't make it rain for 3.5 years, because that's what he did. He prayed for it not to rain. But like you said, God told him it's not going to rain for 3.5 years. So Elijah was like, okay, well, let's go. So when God gives you a promise, be thankful for the promise, but have faith in the promise as well.
He tells us with everything, let your request be known.
Right.
With everything. Through, like you said, prayer, supplication, with thanksgiving.
Yeah.
Let your request be known.
How about
So if it's worth worrying about or worth
I was-
thinking about, it's
worth talking to God about?
What you brought up earlier about believing His promises, and would you talk about thanking Him?
Yeah.
Like I wonder about like salvation, like you've got forgiveness of your sins, you've been saved, you've got salvation. So do we need to continually ask for forgiveness because we've been forgiven? Right?
You're bringing up the doctrine part. Those are, yeah, yeah. Well, the bell. But yes, that's a good question. Maybe we'll tackle that some more next week.